for its insightful and wide-ranging discussion of Romanticism to the crisis of modern science. And I assigned a chapter from Science in the Modern World called The Romantic Reaction, where you really get a sense for the way that Whitehead is trying to respond to the crisis of modern science that was brought about by these new paradigm, this emergence of new paradigms within physics, within biology, so that internal to science, based on science's own process, its own methods, it undermined the Newtonian, the Cartesian Newtonian world picture of a mechanistic universe. So Whitehead's trying to respond to that to come up with a new metaphysical foundation for science. But he's also trying he's participating in this romantic revolt, and he's trying to show how we don't need to decide either we're scientific, enlightened, modern people, or we are reactionary, romantic poets who are more interested in the subjective depths of our own psyche. That somehow the romantics' cry for an understanding of nature that includes a sense of nature's aesthetic value is crucial for an accurate scientific understanding of the universe, right? So truth and beauty do not have to be opposed, right? As Keats himself said, beauty is truth and truth is beauty, right? So Whitehead's trying to justify the romantic sensibility, the poetic sensibility, the nature poets in particular. He talks about Wordsworth quite a bit in that chapter. And many commentators have said that perhaps second only to Plato, the most important influence on Whitehead's philosophical vision was Wordsworth. So before I get into trying to describe for you the way that Whitehead articulates a new cosmology that incorporates relativity theory, quantum theory, evolutionary theory, and complexity theory, I want to go back a little bit to last week to talk about Kant and what Kant had to say, if you remember, about biology in the Critique of Judgment, which was his last critique that he published in 1790, because it's in that critique that many of the post-Kantian thinkers and really the whole romantic understanding of nature took a lot of its cues. Because in there, while in his earlier critiques of pure reason and practical reason, Kant definitely wanted to maintain this sharp boundary between the noumenal realm and the phenomenal realm. In the Critique of Judgment, he talks about purpose in nature. He talks about organisms and self-organizing systems that we can't understand mechanically. And he also talks about art and aesthetics and beauty. And as Plato had already talked about 2 millennia earlier, that beauty is a form or an idea that is closer to our sort of sensory experience than any of the other ideas. We can almost see the eternal form of beauty in a sunset, right, or in a mountain range, or in a waterfall. And that experience of beauty invites us through the sensory realm and allows us to, in a sense, journey into the archetypal domain. And so Kant is reflecting on the beauty of nature. And contrary to his own transcendental principles, he suggests that beauty could be a way for us to feel justified in assuming that some unity, some supersensory unity can bind together the mind and nature. We don't know how it might be possible, but because our mind seems to be organized so as to experience nature as beautiful, clearly there's some hidden concord here, right? And he doesn't go so far as to, speculate about what exactly that hidden concord looks like, what that hidden connection, how it operates. but he suggests we might be justified in assuming, because of our experience of beauty, that the mind, which is free, and nature, which seems determined, are somehow connected. And the thinkers who came after Kant, in particular Goethe and Schelling, really run with this idea. And Schelling he's called the Prince of the Romantics, and took the romantic sensibility from the arts and literature into science and developed a philosophy of nature that instead of understanding nature mechanistically, he wanted to understand it organically. And last week we read just the introduction to a longer book called The Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature, which if I had shared with you the rest of the book, you'd see he goes chapter by chapter, engaging directly with the most advanced theories of electricity and magnetism and chemistry and astronomy that were available in his day. So he's trying to bring this organic, romantic understanding of the relationship between mind and nature and apply it to the hard sciences and show that there's no need for a dichotomy here. We can harmonize these perspectives. And although Whitehead didn't read Schelling directly, he was influenced by many thinkers when he was at Cambridge who were influenced by German idealism. So he got it secondhand. And Whitehead similarly wants to articulate a new basis for science that's not mechanistic but organic. So if we want to go back to Kant for a second, Kant had said, remember, that we couldn't have a mechanistic understanding of organisms, and his exact words were that there will never be a Newton of the grass blade. In other words, there will never be a scientific explanation for how even a mere blade of grass could be produced, because scientific explanation still meant mechanistic explanation. We can't even understand how a mere blade of grass would be produced by mechanistic causes alone. And in the 19th century, Charles Darwin came along and published Origin of Species, and many people thought, oh, Kant was wrong. Here's your Newton of the grass blade, right? Darwin has offered a mechanistic explanation. For what exactly? For life? For how organisms are possible? Not really. If you look closer at what Darwin did with his theory of natural selection, it's about speciation. So it's about how different species of organism can emerge over time. It's a mechanism that would explain how species could differentiate over long, vast stretches of time. It's not an account for how life itself is possible, right? So it's a theory of phylogeny and not ontogeny, right? Ontogeny is the study of individual living organisms. Phylogeny is the study of species of organisms. And we still don't have an adequate mechanistic account for how individual organisms are possible if we're still working within a mechanistic paradigm. So I would argue, and many other philosophers of biology argue, that actually there still is not a Newton of the grass blade, and that Darwin was not that figure. But then, the question is, do we have to understand nature mechanistically? One of my favorite lines from Schelling, I think it was in the essay I signed, the introduction to the Ideas of the Philosophy of Nature last week, where he writes that the particular successions of causes and effects that delude us with the appearance of mechanism disappear as infinitely straight lines in the universal curvature of the organism in which the world itself persists. I'll read that one more time. The particular successions of causes and effects that delude us with the appearance of mechanism disappear as infinitely small straight lines in the universal curvature of the organism in which the world itself persists. So he's saying that when we view nature mechanistically, we're seeing it, we're seeing an appearance, but that nature truly is an organic system. And if we view it as an organic system, we see that linear causality, causality that's not self-organizing, is the exception, and that the true form of causality operating on a global scale, on a macrocosmic scale, is organic, right? And as I mentioned at the very end of class, for Schelling, the universal organism, the world soul, is the archetypal form that is recapitulated in all other organisms, in the first cell. The first cell for Schelling is a microcosmic recapitulation of the macrocosmic organism. So the archetype for organicity is present at the level of the whole universe first, and it recapitulates for finite organisms, right? So it's like the Hermetic microcosm macrocosm polarity, right? So already with Schelling, you're getting this attempt at a new basis for science that's organic rather than mechanistic. Now, this was Schelling was responding in many ways to Lyell, the geologist, and his understanding of deep time, the idea that species could go extinct, that the Earth is far, far older than European philosophers and scientists had thought. So you're getting history is being added to our understanding of the human being and to the human being's place in the natural world. And whereas someone like Kant still thought of the human mind as structured in such a way that it didn't develop, it didn't evolve, the concepts of our understanding were just sort of fixed in place eternally, and that's how the human subject operates, as if we were parachuted onto the earth from another dimension. For Schelling, the human mind, he says that philosophy is nothing else than a natural history of our mind. So for Schelling, the ideas, our way of conceptualizing the world, is a result of a developmental process. And it's a developmental process that's natural. Right? The human mind emerges out of nature as an expression of nature, very much in the way that Goethe was expressing in that poem that Rick read. So Schelling is trying to respond to this discovery of deep time and realizing that the human mind, not only is it embedded in nature, but it is a developmental process that has emerged out of nature over the course of time. But with Whitehead, it was much more obvious in the time that Whitehead was thinking and writing that science needed a new metaphysical basis, because of four basic paradigm-breaking theories, right, that I talk about in the essay that I had you read from Physics of the World Soul. And these are relativity theory, quantum theory, evolutionary theory, and complexity theory. So, I've talked a little bit about evolution already, but part of what evolution brings in is, again, the sense that the human mind, is embedded within nature, an evolutionary product of nature. And the way that Whitehead comes to terms with Darwin's theory of evolution is he tries to imaginatively generalize this idea so that it no longer applies, the idea being Darwin's key insight, right, was evolution by the reproductive inheritance of variation under natural selection, right? So organisms, the organisms that have survived because they were most fit to the environment and were able to reproduce at rates higher than other organisms, right? That's Darwin's theory. Whitehead says, well, we can apply this beyond just the biological realm. We can apply this to energy as such. And for Whitehead, what energy is a series of rhythmic pulsations. And for him, every rhythmic pulsation is inheriting a past and then creatively contributing to that past in such a way that there's a genetic inheritance and a contribution made to that inheritance that can then be selected for in the environment. So with Whitehead, instead of physics and a mechanistic understanding of physics being the most general science, ecology becomes the most general science. And the universe itself, he understands as an ecology of organisms in an evolutionary process together, an evolving ecology of organisms. So he'll talk about atoms as organisms. He'll talk about stars and galaxies as organisms. And he'll talk about the symbiosis of protons and electrons to form atoms, that protons and electrons used to live as separate organisms, but they entered a symbiotic relationship to form the first atoms. And it proved beneficial for protons and electrons to do that. It allowed them to endure. So there's an evolutionary selection that takes place at every level of the universe, right? So this is why ecology replaces physics. Or you could say that physics is the study of, particle physics, let's say, is the study of the smaller organisms. Astrophysics is the study of the larger organisms, and biology is the study of the mesocosmic organisms, the middle realm organisms like us. How's that sitting with you guys?
Good. Really good.
Does it make sense?
Can I ask who Schelling, who Whitehead studied under at Cambridge that had a Schelling influence?
I forget his first name, Bradley, and there are other British idealists.
Green, I think was.
Green, Bradley,
Okay.
a couple other friends of his that were very influential, and they were Hegelians mostly, but I think they considered all, Schelling and Hegel. They appreciated both of them. Whitehead tried to read Hegel, and for some reason he, in Hegel's encyclopedia, he went to the section on mathematics and was not at all impressed with what he read. So based on a few sentences, he dismissed Hegel, which Jung does as well. It's interesting.
Yeah, Jung rejects him because Hegel's philosophy is so close to Jung's psychology that he just, this guy's just writing out of his psyche, and philosophically reifying it. But then he essentially creates a kind of Hegelian.
Right.
Anyway.
Yeah. All right. So.
Before you move on,
Yeah.
you said biology is the mesocosm,
The study of organisms at the mesocosmic scale.
and then
Physics, particle physics, would be the study of organisms at the smallest scale, and astrophysics would be the study of the organisms at the largest scale. But it's organisms from top to bottom for Whitehead. All the way down, all the way up. Right? So that's his way of, in a sense, romanticizing science by putting it on an organic, ecological basis rather than a physical, mechanistic basis.
Can you define organism?
Sure. Organism here would be any system that is self-organizing, that has a permeable membrane that separates it, or at least not separates, but distinguishes it from an environment, and an entity that has purposes of its own. So it's a teleological system that it has purposes internal to itself. It seeks to survive, first of all. It seeks to eat. It seeks to reproduce. It differs from a mechanical system in that, machines can still have purposes, but that purpose is coming from an outside designer. So its purpose is imposed on it from the outside.
So what would a microorganism be? I mean, you're talking about electrons and protons. You find that's kind of like a biological definition of the organism, but I wonder how you can use the same word for like the micro or the macro.
Whitehead does this. He's writing about this in the 1920s, and quantum theory is first being articulated, and the idea that all matter is energy coming out of Einstein is starting to sink in. And the idea in quantum physics is that energy comes in these packets. Whitehead takes that understanding of energy as these rhythmic pulsations, and says that each pulse is an organism, and it's in relationship to other pulses of energy, and that it's purposeful. For him, the idea that you could talk about energy and energy becoming organized as galaxies and stars and so on without any purpose, without any teleology, just was absurd. So he tries to show how, from a totally naturalistic perspective, just to understand, and this is what Kant was saying too, that we can't understand the self-organizing dynamics of nature unless nature is purposeful, right? And the only difference between Whitehead and Kant is that Kant said, for Kant, nature was just was a realm of appearances. The nature that science knows is an apparent nature, and what nature might be in itself, separate from our way of experiencing it, is not something we can really know. Whereas Whitehead's saying, no, nature really is this way. Nature really is organic. It really is purposeful. And our consciousness, is an expression of that purpose. Did you have a comment, Adrian?
Actually, you couldn't ask one exact question.
Oh.
Could you give a definition of the organism?
Right. So Whitehead started his career as a mathematician and a mathematical physicist, and so when Einstein articulated his special theory of relativity in 1905, Whitehead was one of the few people alive who could actually understand the paper that Einstein published. And Whitehead definitely accepts this key insight that Einstein has, and others, Lorentz and other physicists had the similar insight, that space and time cannot be understood apart from one another, right? And Whitehead had been trying to articulate his own forms of geometry in the 1890s, and so he was well positioned to really appreciate Einstein's accomplishment. At the same time, though, he met with Einstein and had a few bones to pick with him about how Einstein was interpreting the relativity of space and time, and the idea that it's not space and time, it's space-time, the space-time continuum, right? And one way to get at what Whitehead was protesting against is to look at what Einstein says in a debate with another process philosopher, Henri Bergson, French philosopher, where Einstein and Bergson had a debate in 1922, and basically Bergson was trying to say that Einstein, your physical theory of time is not the end of the discussion as regards time as such, because Einstein's understanding of time, physical time, totally negated our psychological experience of time. And so, and then Einstein would respond and say, there's no such thing as psychological time. It's his words, a stubbornly persistent illusion. Psychological time would be the time we experience that's irreversible, that moves out of a past that's already sort of determined into a future that's open-ended, right? That's how we experience time. Einstein says the physicist looks at the universe and knows that that kind of time is an illusion. The laws of physics work just as well in either direction. There doesn't need to be a perceiver. But there is a perceiver, and for Einstein it was just a stubbornly persistent illusion that as our science advances we'll be able to sort of scrub away, right? And Whitehead looks at this debate and he sees the bifurcation of nature, right, between the physicist's understanding of a neutral world where space, even if it's space-time, Einstein is really just adding another axis to the Cartesian coordinate grid. He's spatializing time as another, instead of just 3 dimensions, now you have a 4th dimension on the Cartesian grid. It's a spatialization of time. So time is no longer creative becoming as it is in our immediate experience. It's a quantifiable, it's a measurable quantity, and that gets inserted into Einstein's equations. So in Einstein, you have a deterministic universe where the future, in some sense, already exists. And our perception of moving through time, again, is just an illusion, as far as physicists are concerned. And Whitehead wants to say we can spatialize time for the practical purposes of measurement and coordinating our activities with clocks and so on. There's nothing wrong with that. But he thought that Einstein was Einstein thought he was making a scientific claim when really he was making a metaphysical claim. And Whitehead is saying, as science, what you're doing is fine because we need to measure things to be scientific. But as metaphysics, we have to accept that time is only falsely spatialized. Einstein was eliminating time and replacing it with another spatial dimension. So what Whitehead actually articulated an alternative mathematical formalism to explain relativity. It made all the same predictions that Einstein's equations did. The only difference is it was using Euclidean geometry instead of this non-Euclidean geometry of warped space-time or bending space-time. Whitehead didn't think that, he thought it was another example of misplaced concreteness to talk about space-time as this sort of arena out there that matter moves through. For Whitehead, his ontology is not based on material particles, but on what he calls actual occasions of experience. So he moves out of a materialistic ontology of inert particles banging into each other in this arena, whether it's a spatial arena or a spatiotemporal arena. It's still this notion that Einstein had of a container with particles moving in it. Whitehead moves into an ontology of events that are interlocked in a community of relationships, and these events are experiential. So not only is his cosmology organic from top to bottom, but atoms and photons, they're experiencing a world. And they're not conscious in the sense that human beings are conscious, but I think we would all agree that we have experiences every day that are not conscious, right? We're not aware of ourself doing it. Maybe after it happens, we look back and say, wow, I just drove 50 miles and I don't even remember any of it, all right? So if we really look at our own experience, we see that there are plenty of examples of non-conscious experience. And Whitehead is saying that there are lower degrees of experience present everywhere. And for him, space-time is not what's really real. What's really real are these organisms experiencing each other. And what the physicist articulates as space-time is a mathematical generalization of the forms of relationship that are possible in our particular universe. So what's primary are the organisms, and space-time is an abstraction derived from the way that they relate to one another. So it's like a figure ground shift. Instead of saying space-time is ready-made and pre-given and out there, and that we're inside of it, Whitehead's saying space-time, in a sense, is inside of each of us. And it's brought forth through our relationships with one another. Right? How does that sit? Is that making any sense?
Is that similar to velocity equals, so like velocity is, or movement is primary, and then distance and time are like abstractions? Or like this kind of typical d equals rt, so d over t equals r. In other words, like the rate, things are changing, right? And then we basically abstract space and time, or call it space-time, depending on. But that's not what's primary was the rate and the velocity, and those two are taken.
I don't know if it's exactly like that. It's more about the relationship between what's concrete and what's abstract. And for Whitehead, it's always experience that is concrete. And
We're equating that with like rate or velocity, like movement. But maybe it's completely off.
yeah, I don't know if that analogy works really well. We'll have to talk more about that. It's more about Whitehead wanting to preserve the experience of organisms as what's most concrete, and this geometrical understanding of space-time as being an abstraction from the concrete experience of organisms relating to one another in an evolving ecology, right? So for Whitehead, organisms are not in this environment called space-time. The environment is brought forth through the relationships between the organisms. Because really what the environment is, when you're talking about ecology, is other organisms, right? There is no out there. There's a community of organisms, and they're all experiencing each other.
When you ask how does that sit, and I think that it's really hard to find any place in the way that we live today to have something like that sit.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it strikes me as the one way of potentially achieving a total shift in worldview is
Right.
if more people could understand or feel or live into that somehow.
Yeah.
And as to how you live into it, it's almost impossible.
Yeah. And, Whitehead's protesting against the tyranny of abstractions that are mistaken for something concrete and real.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's trying to reverse that, and to remind physicists and to remind the educated public who take Neil deGrasse Tyson's word on everything as gospel truth, that the physicists are, Whitehead will say that nature as it is understood by physicists is in a sense a derived concept. It's not the nature of our experience.
Right.
And the nature of our experience is what he wants to say is fundamental. All the scientific abstractions, to the extent that they remain coherent and adequate, will be derived from our concrete experience. We should never have a science that explains away our concrete experience as an illusion. That leads us to, among other things, an ecological crisis. Because if it turns out that nature is full of purposes and values beyond the human, and we design a civilization that doesn't respect or acknowledge the values and purposes of the organisms around us, well, it's obvious what the result would be.
So in a way, it's a reflection of on our own reason and the structures that come with reasoning. It's
Yeah.
like becoming conscious of how reason works
Mm-hmm.
in a way.
And recognizing that reason doesn't necessarily have to alienate us from nature. Reason doesn't necessarily have to think in mechanistic terms, objectifying everything.
So it's opening some other perspectives for the reason itself.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can time exist without organisms? I mean, it's just, time is, if there's no change, can there be time? But isn't time kind of like a measure of change?
Um,
Organisms change and they don't have organisms.
Right. For Whitehead, one of the reasons he was compelled to say that experience goes all the way down to the quantum level is that one of the things quantum physics revealed is the way that nature isn't ever present at an instant. A photon takes a certain amount of time to be a photon.
Right.
If you don't allow that full process to unfold, you don't have a full proton. So what that means is that to be a photon, there's this process that unfolds of inheriting the immediate past and anticipating the immediate future. And that's what time is.
That's just what Taylor was saying about the self, that it's embedded, that you can't have a self if you don't see it as embedded in an unfolding narrative
Right.
as a context.
Yeah, right. So if it turns out that quantum physics is telling us nature doesn't occur at an instant, there's no nature at an instant, nature needs time to be what it is at every level, then that's in a way inserting experience at the most foundational level. Because what experience is this sense of being open to the past and open to the future. And our experience is a meeting of those two temporal, domains. So time is experience, in a sense.
If the organism experiences it, and I'm just saying, if there's no organism, can there be time?
No.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
my question.
Yeah. Okay.
And that was the same problem in reconciling quantum physics with relativity to get, for the time it would take to get from one end of the atom to the other, or one end of the photon to the other.
Mhm.
It was impossible for them to explain, and that's one of the reasons they can't reconcile the two theories.
Right.
I can't remember the name of the guy who,
Max Planck?
it's,
Yeah.
Planck's constant, Planck's constant is
Mhm.
that period where you can't
Right.
explain the motion in between the two,
Mhm.
but that's where the experience is taking
Right.
place in a different view of time.
Yeah. Will and then Bev?
So cool.
So where in this would do the constant laws of motion and physics fit in?
Mhm.
And would he perhaps have been very intrigued by, for instance, Sheldrake's idea that it's possible that our constants actually might not be completely constant and
Habits
I mean-
rather than laws.
Yeah.
Yeah, habits rather than laws.
It's definitely totally
but-
compatible with Sheldrake, because I think Sheldrake largely gets that idea from Whitehead.
Well, actually, he didn't. I talked to him about it once. We had a small meeting at this castle in Scotland one time, and he. What's that? Oh.
Just a small meeting.
And he couldn't understand. He said, I was saying how many parallels there were with what he was saying with Whitehead, and he said, is there a good book on by somebody who could make Whitehead more intelligible for him? Later, this was back around 2007 or so, and a little while later, he had brought in Whitehead in a more explicit way and didn't seem to have that problem. I don't know he came up with the morphic field. I mean, it's not that Whitehead didn't seed it in some very deep way,
Yeah.
but I don't think he actually, I think it came up kind of as a organic response to his botanical and
I didn't realize that.
Studies,
I guess
yeah.
in his later books he does talk about Whitehead as someone who saw the laws of physics as habits. rather than-
I think he knew the parallels with Whitehead. I just don't think that he had the it wasn't like a direct influence, and it was more like, how we sometimes read somebody after we've had an idea and go, this is affirming it, and
Yeah,
this is a very respectable person, and I'm going to refer.
Right, gotcha.
So is that how he treats the constant laws of physics, etc.? I mean, how does Whitehead actually treat them in his own work?
Yeah, the laws of physics, so-called, are, for Whitehead, just really sort of locked-in habits that have evolved over the course of billions of years. There's no reason to believe that they won't change in the future, and almost certainly they will. He writes somewhere that the fact that there are 3 dimensions of space in our particular moment in cosmic evolution is a contingent fact. Tomorrow there could be 303 dimensions of space because of the potential for creative emergence. Somewhere else he writes about how a civilization 1,000 years from now could look back at our 3-dimensional understanding of space and laugh at how quaint it was because the universe has changed, or we've observed a distant quarter of the universe that we see has a totally different dimensionality, and there's a wave of dimensional disruption coming towards us that's going to transfigure everything. So the stability of the laws of physics they're not eternal, right? They can be stable, and indeed they do seem to be stable enough that we can make discoveries in astrophysics based on the assumption that they're universal and that they've pretty much been that way for 1 billion years. But Whitehead's metaphysics is such that it's better to talk about them as habits, like really ingrained habits. Yeah.
Would Whitehead be considered a materialist?
No.
Does mind perceive matter?
No.
No.
For him, so you can talk about it in terms of mind and matter, subject and object. For him, he's really asking us to move out of that whole way of thinking, so that he does still use language like subject and object, but for him, instead of them being like separate substances, they become poles in one process. So the way he describes experience in the most general terms, which would apply to our own human experience and to the experience of a photon, is that it starts by an inheritance of all of the feelings in the universe around us, and we experience that universe as objects. So we experience and feel the objects around us, and Whitehead's term for feeling is prehension. We prehend them, and gradually our sense of subjectivity emerges as a product of all of those feelings of objects, right? So it goes from a multitude of objects that concress, grow together into one subjective experience, and as soon as we reach that subjective experience, it perishes and becomes an object that's then felt by the next process of concrescence that feels all the objects produced. So the subject doesn't have experience of objects. The subject is a result of the growing together of all the objects, right? And a subject is not just a subject, because as soon as it reaches its sense of unity, bringing all those feelings together into some coherent, single subjective appreciation of it all, that moment of experience dies. It perishes and becomes an object.
Is that the pulse?
That's the pulsation, yeah. So what is a subject in one moment is an object in the next moment, right? So there's no sharp ontological divide between subject and object anymore, or between mind and matter. So you could say what we call matter is just when it's looking at the universe from the perspective of what's already been actualized, looking at the universe, looking at the past, what's already been achieved by this creative process. That's what matter would be called. And mind would be the sense of what remains possible, the decisions that remain possible given what's been actualized. So mind is future-oriented, matter is past-oriented, you might say.
I'm sorry, can you repeat what you said on matter just before that? Just before that.
What we call, when we refer to matter, if we were thinking in terms of Whitehead's cosmology, matter would be that aspect of the universe that's already actualized, right? It's the part of the creative process that's finished. Adrian?
In quantum mechanics, when you make a measurement in the present, you can determine the properties of events which happened at previous junctions.
Mm-hmm.
Does Whitehead make sense of that in this causality of experience?
You're talking about like non-locality, or?
No, events in which are conceivably in the past don't have properties until observations are made in the present.
Right. He does. If you read a little bit further in the reading that from Physics of the World Soul, I talk about two different ways that the way that he reconciles relativity theory and quantum theory, where causality and relativity operates based on a finite speed of light, whereas causality in quantum theory is instantaneous and can sometimes even seem to go back in time. I think it might take us too far. I'd have to unpack so much to get to a place where it would make sense, but yes is the answer to your question.
Matt, could I just ask, when you're reading Whitehead, and Whitehead is talking about occasions of experience,
Yeah.
Do you think in Whitehead's mind, his first, there's always a background image behind what anybody's writing. Is the background image for him at the quantum level, or is it at the human experience, that occasion of experience that you as a subject, you know what I mean?
He's a deep reader of William James's psychology and James's notion of the specious present, where our experience is sort of a synthesis of the past that we're inheriting and the future that we're opening onto. So I think he probably has James's idea of experience in mind.
Which is a human
Yeah,
experience.
but he thinks that James has articulated it's a description of experience that's general enough that it's distilled off all of the uniquely human aspects of our consciousness, so that it's the most fundamental description of experience that he thinks is applicable at the quantum level.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah.
Just a quick clarification on the definition of habit.
Yeah.
So is habit a reoccurring pattern?
Repetition.
And it happens so many times that there's a predictability in it,
Right.
which is why we can predict things. But 99% doesn't mean 100.
Right.
So habit's more of that entrenched.
Right. And as an organism becomes more complex, the capacity for novelty increases. So at the level of physics, particle physics, things seem really habitual, so much so that we talk about laws. They don't change very much, at least in the time frames that human beings have been observing. When you get to the level of living cells and multicellular organisms and human beings, there's way more of a capacity for breaking habits. I mean, human beings are still very habitual creatures at the same time, and yet our experience invites in more of an awareness of possibility in each moment, whereas for a helium atom, the possibilities left open for each moment are kind of narrow. Basically, it's going to follow the gravitational gradient with some very, very minor, statistically insignificant variations, right? Whereas a human being, statistically, human beings are pretty predictable too, turns out. But individuals, not so much.
Which would explain why Einstein caught on and we're in an Einstein world and not a Whitehead yet. Because we're getting more complex, thus.
Right.
So, thank you.
Deepak?
So, I don't know that I position it correctly. What I see Whitehead, he still has this scientific background, but he's still in his realm of romanticism. So it's more about romantic scientist thing. So, one, do you agree with that thing? And the second is, are there other people who are, the philosopher who are under that category, or after Whitehead we have a big gap in that?
I think calling him a romantic scientist or philosopher is accurate. Generally, anyone looking at the universe in terms of organism rather than mechanism would be more of a romantic. But he also, in the chapter of the romantic reaction, he criticizes Keats for being kind of dismissive of science, right? So he's trying to strike a balance here and say, like, and he has a similar criticism of Bergson, who was content to sort of leave science to continue with its same method of objectifying and its same understanding of nature as mechanical, so long as it accepted that the biological world and the psychological world could not be reduced to that. Whereas Whitehead saying, no, we can reform physics so that it's on an organic basis too, and then have a coherence in our picture of the universe, so that we don't have science doing its separate thing over there that doesn't have any relationship to how human beings live, what our psychology is like, and so on. So he wants to infuse and reimagine science itself, so that it's still mathematical, still abstract, but it's rooted in concrete experience, and it doesn't try to explain concrete experience away. Yeah.
David Bohm is doing that too. So, in his instance, a lot of physicists.
Right, he would be an example of a contemporary. Well, he's no longer with us, but he lived. When did he die? About 10.
More recently, like
90s.
He was at the ITA conference in Prague in '92, and he died pretty soon after that.
Okay, 90s. Lee Smolin is a physicist who's writing a lot of thick books right now. Roberto Unger, a philosopher. Lee Smolin talks about habits of nature, and he wants to reform physics so that it takes time more seriously, our experiential understanding of time more seriously. Smolin. He has a lot of great videos on YouTube. You might enjoy his work.
Sheldrake, of course.
Sheldrake. Adrian?
How is value being realized in Whitehead's universe? Is it in novelty? Is that
not just in novelty. I think.
Is there like a basic, like this is the teleological kind of reason for the universe?
Beauty would be he says beauty is the teleology of the universe.
So you need an experience to have beauty.
Right. The whole point of there being a universe at all for Whitehead is the experience of beauty and the evolutionary intensification of our capacity to experience beauty. So he thinks to understand the evolution of life on Earth without a sense of teleology, we could make no sense of why organisms would develop ever more sensitive organs of perception, despite the fact that that makes us more susceptible to pain and suffering. It's because we want to experience more beauty and we don't care if it hurts more at the same time.
So survivalism.
Survival isn't enough to explain life. Survival is one aspect, but life seems to want to thrive, not just survive. If it was about, he says, if it was about survival, the better strategy would have been to remain rocks because they live a lot longer.
But it's not just survival, it's survival and reproduction.
Survival and
reproduction.
And reproduction.
Make more of yourself.
Yeah.
So a rock couldn't do that.
Makes sense.
So, right. A rock couldn't do that, but
That's a value, and that's a more than a surviving, it's a thriving, I think, getting
sure.
to your
Yeah,
point.
rocks survive, they don't thrive. And
Incoherence, to greater coherence as well. I think Bateson had this little story about, second level, if a rat is being taught in a cage to push, taught how to explore, even if it delivers a shock, or it will continue to push the button just to see
For
if
pleasure.
it's sometimes.
yeah.
The story was about how it almost was like the rat had to know whether it was going to shock him or not. So exploration involved a higher level of coherence with the wider
Right.
world, unmanifest world, or
Like, why is this human scientist trying to torture me?
something.
But he's like, let's just mess with their data point.
And play is like that too.
Sure.
Does Whitehead talk about why we perceive something as beautiful versus, why is a sunset beautiful but a garbage dump isn't beautiful?
In some,
It's kind of like an arbitrary decision about we're saying something's beautiful, isn't it? Or is there some kind of
that's a perennial debate in aesthetics, I guess. But I think beauty, for Whitehead defines beauty as the harmonization of contrasts. And something is more beautiful if it's harmonizing more extreme contrasts. So, when there's a way in which, if we can find a way to make a dumpster beautiful by harmonizing it with something else, that would elicit perhaps as yet undiscovered heights of beauty. And in a way, for Whitehead's theology is such that he says that God doesn't create the world, God saves the world, and God is the poet of the world. So that no matter what happens, you look at human history and the horrible, horrible things that are happening, it's God's role to somehow turn that into tragedy in the sense of poetry, right? So even the dumpster fires are somehow miraculously transfigured from the divine perspective into something beautiful, and we just don't have the perspective yet capable of harmonizing the contrasts in a way that would allow us to perceive it. Yeah.
I think the sunset and the sunrise is a perfect metaphor in some
That-
way.
Yeah.
Let Bev go.
Let's.
Yeah, well, a long time ago, I had one comment to
Yeah.
make.
Sorry, I didn't get back.
Which was that in quantum physics, they couldn't figure out why when you interjected the observer into the experiment, it changed the result, which I think Whitehead's explanation would explain that. Because having another organism in there changed the experience, so it's obvious that it's going to change, it's going to make a change.
Right.
Just having them just as observer even,
Mhm.
just they're part of it.
Yeah.
So, in response to the garbage dump question, I was going to say that in Buddhism, the aim is to have a sense of equanimity,
Yeah.
so that that even this flesh is going to age and decay, but it's still beautiful. Life itself is beautiful. So the decaying, which you see in the garbage dump, still has beauty.
Mhm.
If you can reach that level of
Yeah.
equanimity where you can see that in everything.
Right. Yeah. I mean, in a sense, I think what Whitehead is suggesting is that everything is beautiful if you see it from the divine perspective. Right? Yeah. And what you said about the observer effect in quantum physics, often when popular accounts of quantum physics and this particular paradox are discussed, they make it seem as though human consciousness is responsible for collapsing the wave function, right? And when a human observer isn't there, everything's in this state of indeterminate superposition because there's no consciousness to observe it. And what Whitehead is saying is if experience goes all the way down, the universe is observing itself. It doesn't need human beings to observe it, right? So there's an interpretation of quantum theory called the decoherence theory, which is the idea that the wave function decoheres, or it observes itself and collapses out of superposition because it's observing itself, because there are occasions of experience everywhere doing the observation. He doesn't need to be a human conscious observer. So it does away with that sense of anthropocentric.
Yeah, so in other words, if you put a rabbit into the experiment, that would change it just the same as, maybe in a different way, but it will still create.
The experimental apparatus itself, the photon gun and the film receiving it, and it's all observing itself already. Experience is taking place even in the inorganic realm.
But something changes when you interject another element, another life form, right? I mean, that was originally, like in the Tao of physics, he talks about, that having the observer changes it. This is more from a spiritual level, a energy level.
Yeah.
That you're interjecting something into the thing by being part of it and not outside observing it. Being inside the actual event instead of outside the event makes the event different.
Well, I think what Whitehead's trying to do is make quantum theory not seem so counterintuitive and spooky.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was saying. It seems like within his theory, that would be just a natural event. That wouldn't sound spooky at all. That would seem like that's what's supposed to happen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So you define beauty, you said that Whitehead defined beauty as a harmonization of contrast, and that just reminded me of Hegel with his dialectic theory of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and then we are going into more harmonization of these syntheses.
Right.
And then you also said before that he was not a Hegelian in a sense that he didn't study it. So
he
what happened there?
didn't appreciate Hegel directly when he read him, but he does say in the preface of his book Process and Reality, which is his magnum opus, that the result of his metaphysical inquiry ends up looking a lot like absolute idealism. But he gets there through different means, starting with experience and empiricism. He always thought of himself as a good empiricist, a radical empiricist, really. Like Jung, but he was willing to talk about ontology and metaphysics, and so he didn't appreciate Hegel's philosophy of mathematics very much, but this is coming from someone who was advancing. He was at the cutting edge of mathematics at the turn of the 19th and the 20th century, so that's not what Hegel is remembered for. But through his colleagues who were Hegelians, he really did appreciate that sense of the dialectical process. And it's Hegel and Whitehead are compatible thinkers. I think Hegel's got more of a drive towards articulating a completed, finished system that explains everything. He's got that totalizing drive, whereas Whitehead is more humble and says, I'm going to articulate a metaphysical system, but this is just my best effort now, and feel free to tinker with it. it's open-ended. Our knowledge will never be vast enough to encompass the creativity of the universe. So
He's more Jamesian
yeah.
in that sense, and James was trying to oppose the Hegelian view because it was just so systematic and all-encompassing and could become a bit dogmatic. And so Whitehead, in a sense, is kind of a synthesis of both.
Yeah. So, you know, I am bringing Whitehead into this just because I feel like in the 20th century, and you know, even in the 19th century, this started. There was this crisis in the scientific picture of the world, where prior to this crisis point, the West had a more or less coherent cosmology. It was dualistic, but there was a sense that there was this big picture that we could fit ourselves into. And with the collapse of the Newtonian picture as a result of quantum theory and relativity theory, we still don't have, physicists haven't even unified quantum theory and relativity yet, and they're trying to figure out how to do that. But we don't have a coherent cosmology anymore, and so we default back to the mechanistic picture, even though our best science tells us that's not accurate anymore. It's as though, in the 18th century, the mechanistic idea filtered into all the other special sciences like biology and psychology and sociology, and then in physics, the mechanistic picture fell to pieces, and the other sciences didn't get the update. They didn't get the memo about that. And so Whitehead is a 20th century thinker who understood the mathematics of relativity and quantum theory, and understood the history of philosophy, especially modern philosophy and Plato and Aristotle. And he's a new modern day Aquinas, in the sense that he's able to bring together the most advanced science with a deep spiritual sense for the value and beauty and importance of the natural world. And he's able, at the same time that he's re-enchanting the natural world, he isn't diminishing the human role in all of this either. So, I wanted to spend an hour and talk about him with you guys, because I think, a lot of us hope that the 21st century may be the Whiteheadian century, and that in 100 years we'll talk about, and the way we talk about Newton's cosmology, we'll talk about Whitehead's cosmology, because he provides what may be the beginnings of a cosmological backdrop for a new kind of ecological civilization. Yeah. Any other?
I have one real quick question.
Yeah.
If you could contrast, you're saying you absolute idealism for Whitehead. Can you contrast that with Plato's idealism apart? I mean, there's subject-object and the enchantment of the world and all that. But what's the
Well, so if by absolute idealism you mean Hegel in particular, the difference between Plato and Hegel is that Hegel added this idea of historical development, whereas Plato was thinking about an eternal universe. And for Hegel's historicizing the whole historicizing idealism, and so he gives an account for how he was able to arrive at absolute knowledge only because of this long historical dialectic.
right?
That goes back through the whole history of philosophy.
Not from any kind of eternal laws or eternal ideas or
Right.
anything.
It's like philosophy needed to go through this whole 2,500 year process in order for it to become possible for Hegel to look back and understand how absolute knowledge is possible.
Well, I wasn't talking about Hegel, though. I was talking about Whitehead. You also called him an absolute idealist, that he came to it from radical empiricism.
I wouldn't call Whitehead an absolute idealist.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
I thought I heard you say that.
He just said he, at the end of his metaphysical discussion and process in reality, his system ends up looking a lot like absolute idealism.
Okay.
But it's on an empirical basis, he says. So
And it completely, you know, okay. I was just
yeah,
thinking
we can talk more about that. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much. Great lecture.